Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy.
Hello, dear listeners, and welcome back to the podcast. Today, I have a new guest on, Dr. Allan Bacon. Allan, welcome on the show.
Hey, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we can bring a lot of value to people listening today.
Yes, I hope so too. As I was telling you off air, I've been following your content for a long time, and today I really want to delve deeply into obesity and to have an honest conversation about it. But before we get there, the question with which I always open the podcast with new guests is, who are you? What do you do? And why are you so awesome at it?
So that's a difficult question to answer. Hopefully I live up to expectations. My name's Dr. Allan Bacon. I am a physique and health coach these days. I switched from a career in medical to coaching because it was always a passion for me. I mean, I loved nutrition, I loved training, and I loved being able to help people. And this is one of those areas where I thought was very missing in people's lives. I mean, we all know that we should go to the doctor. We all know to take medicines that were recommended, but how great would it be if we can actually cut all that out and not even need to take the medicines? And so these days, I really like going from the perspective of let's prevent problems before they happen. And not only prevent problems before they happen, but give people the best lives possible. And, when you had contacted me and said that you want to talk about skeletal muscle and the health benefits that it brings. I mean, this is the number one thing that people can do to improve their health overall. I mean, it's lose excess body fat and build lean muscle. These two things will do virtually everything that you're trying to get, taken care of through the methods that you do them. And people will come to me and they'll say, "Hey, I want to improve my brain health, or I want to improve my gut health, or I want to look better in a bathing suit." Well, the funny thing is, the answer is the same to getting all of these things done. You get your training down, you get proper nutrition in play, you sleep, and you stress relieve. How do I look better in the bathing suit? Those four things. How do I optimize gut health? Funny, same four things. It's literally the answer for everything in health and fitness. And it's difficult for people to fathom this because in social media today, what people push is that you need this special thing to do this part, and you need this special thing to do this part. And what they're ignoring is that those little special tricks are maybe 2 or 3% of the equation, and then 97% is proper nutrition, training, sleep, stress relief. And so it's funny when you see these super big accounts on social media, they're big because they focus on that 2 to 3% and it seems new and fun. But the people that are really doing it right are focusing on that 97% because if we start to value that, if we start to master the basics, that's where you get success. And that extra 2 to 3% may not even matter. And in the large scale case, it just doesn't. And so I started getting into this because I saw this big gap in what people thought was important and what was actually important. And there's a reason that people aren't losing that excess body fat. There's a reason that they're not building this lean muscle because they're focused on cold plunges. They're focused on, keto and fasting and all these things that largely just don't matter when you get the full picture. So it was a very elongated way of saying I wanted to get into this because I wanted to draw people's focus onto what works and have them finally get off that diet roller coaster.
That's an excellent introduction, a great way to offer me a segue into the first question. But actually, I'm going to deviate from my outline to begin with because you make such an interesting point that people focus on what doesn't matter because it looks shiny and interesting and different, and
Sure.
they don't focus so much on the basics. I think there's this perception that the basics almost feel frustrating. And when you say, okay, you need to exercise, eat well, and sleep well and manage your stress, people will say, well, it's almost like they're thinking it's always the same thing and it's not been working for me. And whereas now there are these big accounts pushing these interesting new concepts, but from my perspective, it in my view, it's reassuring that the basics are the most effective tools, because those 2-3%, that those actions that constitute the 2-3% you've mentioned, they're sometimes really difficult for the average person to carry out on a regular basis.
Yeah, they are, and I think that people feel bored by these things, or they feel like they don't work, or they feel like they're not exciting, um, because they don't realize what actually doing them correctly for an extended period of time does. I mean, people will try these types of things for 1, 2, 3 months and then give up because it feels difficult. And I think that the concepts behind them are simple, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy. And so, revamping the way that you eat and getting in and training 3, 4, 5 times a week or whatever it is that you're planning on training, over time can seem boring. And optimally, what we do is we start to actually enjoy the process itself. We find value in the journey and not just the before and after. And unfortunately, most people focus on that before and after. If we can start to actually enjoy the process itself, life becomes a lot easier. And like I said, optimally, the goal would be to have intrinsic motivation to do things, to literally go to the gym because you enjoy going to the gym. That's optimal. It's not necessarily where most people will go, and that's okay. You don't have to love going to the gym to gain the benefits of going to the gym. You don't have to love eating vegetables to gain the benefits of eating vegetables. And the example that I like to give in this situation is, there's a quote by Muhammad Ali, and he said that he hated every moment of training, but he loved winning. And so he never made it to that intrinsic side of the equation, but he found value in what he was doing. He liked the outcomes that it gave. He liked how it made him feel. He liked how it made him perform. And if you can start to find the benefits that you get from doing these things, that can make your life a lot easier. And I think people undervalue the benefits that these bring because maybe they didn't know the small little nuances within these things to actually make them work very well. Maybe they were trying to essentially raw dog their nutrition and they're like, okay, well, if I just eat less, then I'm going to be fine. And they starve themselves to death. And then, that deficit was so low that yes, they lost weight, but it was unsustainable. Or maybe they needed to make some changes to their food choices. Maybe they weren't getting enough protein. I mean, and this is a huge thing that we see all the time with Gen Pop switching to a healthier lifestyle, is they're like, okay, well, I'm gonna eat clean. But eating clean doesn't necessarily mean that you have a smart overall diet. And it's just it becomes a very restrictive feeling. And it's not that you don't have to make concessions, because typically if you're overweight or obese or lack lean muscle, you're going to need to change what you do. So if you don't change, you're not going to change. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that you have to fall back on a 1990s bodybuilder diet where you're eating boiled chicken and broccoli for every meal and driving yourself insane. And so the nuance within the simple can be difficult. And I think that that is where people will lack that focus to be able to really make it successful for them long term. And this is where getting a coach can really make a big difference, because they can open your eyes to what these simple changes are that can actually make it sustainable. They can set proper expectations for you, which is a huge thing, because people will see these changes online and they'll say, hey, look, this person had this dramatic before and after, and I just want that, and not realize, one, how long it took, two, maybe the person was on anabolic steroids and you're not, and so that change is much more dramatic than what you believe, over a certain period of time. And by setting the proper expectations with the right plan in place, then you can actually work on mastering those basics that we talked about. So the basics seem boring, and maybe they don't feel like they work because maybe they're not moving as fast as you think that they should be, but maybe they're moving as fast as they can. And so if you just calmed down and told yourself to be patient and trust the process, you would have been where you wanted to be years ago. But instead, you're jumping off and on these plans constantly. You're trying everything new that you see. Like you said, it's something shiny and new. Maybe you're focusing on all these things that are on different podcasts that are out there to, essentially act as clickbait in the health industry. And so you're taking your time to do these things. You're taking every supplement on, under the sun. You're doing all of these ancillary things for recovery and to, boost your metabolism. If anybody says that they're going to boost your metabolism, it's 99% going to be a lie. And so, the answers still fall back onto these same basic things. And so we're getting our attention drawn away from these basic things. And because we're not putting forward smart plans with patience for extended periods of time, we feel like it doesn't work. And if it's as simple as maybe you and I are putting out there, it can also cause people to feel like maybe they're a failure. Because if they knew largely what they should have been doing all this entire time, well, why aren't they succeeding? And it's just because you don't have those little tips or tricks to keep these habits and routines in place. It's not necessarily because you're a failure, it's because you're being challenged with something that you don't know. I mean, it's similar to, I can certainly teach myself to repair a car, but it's not necessarily really worth my time to learn that. And so this is where getting a coach can make it a lot easier for you, because you can start to put things in perspective and then focus on what you should be focusing on, which is getting it done, instead of always wondering, well, should I try something different? Maybe I should give up on this because it's not working as fast as possible. And if I tell a person, hey, look, a proper rate of weight loss for you is maybe a pound a week, or even less than that if you're a leaner individual. For a lot of people, they would be like, well, that doesn't sound like much at all. And if they feel like they're trying really hard and they've only lost a pound and a half in 2 weeks, they're like, well, this isn't working. But if I say, well, if you're losing a pound a week, that's over 50 pounds a year. And that seems like a lot, but it doesn't seem like a lot in your first 2 or 3 months. And so I think that people will really need to have that proper expectation set. And that way you can actually be comfortable in putting forward those plans that you have in place.
I love everything you said. Obviously, I'm a coach too, and I think that the value of a coach lies in giving people expectations, but also perspective. As you said, a pound a week is 52 pounds in a year, even if it doesn't sound like a lot in a week. And in
Right.
addition to that, on the topic of failure, the way I like to frame it with my clients is you're never going to fail. It's the tool that fails you. I think there's also the tendency to think of a diet or a training program as being definitely correct, and possibly because of the tendency for these products to be one size fits all and available for free on the internet. So then you may be led to believe, well, if I do this diet or this training program, it works for everyone. And then it doesn't work for you and you feel like a failure. And that's why it's hard to conceptualize that you're not a failure. It's just that these are tools, and there are so many different tools to accomplish the same goal. It's a matter of finding the tools that work for you in this season of your life, and that help you build habits that you're going to stick to long term.
Well, in reality, you can't fail. You can't fail as long as you don't give up. As long as you keep trying, it's a failure isn't a permanent failure. I like to call them challenges because it kind of sets them into the right mindset for me. But if you fail, look at it as, okay, I can look at this and I can say, yes, I failed. That doesn't mean that I'm a failure. That means that I failed in this specific instance, or I was challenged in this specific instance. If you start to look at those failures as learning opportunities, one, it's really important that you're honest with yourself and say, okay, I screwed up. But if you look at that screw up as, you know what, I know that I screwed up and I know where I screwed up. And if I look at this critically and I start to figure out ways that I could have avoided this or fixed this in the time period, then it's just a learning experience. I mean, this is like when any kid goes out in there, I'm gonna use your term, where they're playing football and they're learning to kick a football for the first time. You're not gonna do it right. And so you try and try and try. And if you had a kid who wanted to play football or soccer, you tell them, just because you missed a free kick doesn't mean you never take a free kick again. You practice and you get better and you get better and you get better. And if you need to, you get a coach in soccer or football. And then you learn how to you figure out where you are making those mistakes as a team. And then you start to put forward those changes. So if you start to look at these challenges as learning experiences with the idea in the back of your mind, I can admit to myself that I screwed up, but that's okay because I can do better, then it doesn't matter. I mean, these are little blips on the radar towards you bettering yourself. And I think that people are very hard on themselves. And this isn't to condemn people in any way, because I'm certainly the same way with myself. But if you were going to be talking to your kid or a friend and they said, "Oh, I had 2 slices of pizza this weekend." So fucking what? Get back on plan. You're completely fine. It doesn't matter. Did you make a conscious choice to have those 2 pieces of pizza? Maybe it was a date night. Maybe it was a special occasion. Then it doesn't even matter to begin with, because there was a reason to do it, as long as it was a conscious choice. If you feel like you were brought in by emotion, or something bad happened that day, or it was a difficult day and you had it, well, if you feel like it really wasn't a conscious choice, that's when you look back on it and you say, okay, I screwed up. What can I learn from this? Was there something that caused me to do this? Should I be on the lookout for that in the future? If this happens, do I do something different? Do I put a substitution in play? Do I go do laundry? Do I go play video games? Do I do something that's different than what this would be? Do I substitute an activity? Do I substitute a food? Maybe if, I know that when I get really stressed out, I reach for pizza. Okay, well, I could go read a book, or I could have something else enjoyable that is shifted a little bit more towards that moderation side of the equation. Maybe I really like Greek yogurt with fruit in it. And you'd start to put these things forward in the future to really give you those steps towards where you're trying to go. Now, it still goes back to proper nutrition, training, sleep, stress relief, right? Because this is the proper nutrition part. But you're giving yourselves those habits, routines, tips, tricks that will actually make things better. And this is where you have those conversations with people, or critically look up things online and try to put these strategies forward to make the changes. And so, is it simple to say, hey, look, just put some substitutions in play, or hey, look, just reevaluate your situation? Yeah, it's simple. But if you haven't been told that before, if you haven't been taught that, it's not something that's in the forefront of your mind, so you won't think about it. So being conscious of the things that you have to, the tools in your toolbox is important. But then reminding you that these exist is really important too. So when we talk about these things, I highly recommend that people write these down, and then you'll be able to reference them in the future, because if it is in the forefront of your mind, it's something that you're actually going to put forward. Whereas if it's on a podcast that you hear one time and never write it down and just kind of move on with your life, you're going to forget it. And that's just the way that the things are. You don't have these secondhand nature skills until you work on them. Again, it's like taking a free kick. You're going to have to practice it over and over and over until it becomes automatic. And it's the same way with your habits. And so anything with nutrition, training, all of these things will take practice over time and constant exposure to really get you there. So don't get frustrated. Just realize that it is simple. It's just going to take some work to change your life.
Brilliantly said. Now, what I want to do is I want to circle back to a couple of points you made earlier on. One thing you said is that people tend to focus more on the before and after pictures and less on developing intrinsic motivation by learning to enjoy the process. And you also said that you got into the health and fitness space as a coach because you wanted to help people focus on what really matters. So I'm going to bring these 2 points together to ask you a question about building muscle, because I find that more often than not, people focus on the aesthetic benefits of having more muscle mass. And that includes me, because I find muscle mass fascinating, but also I'm passionate about bodybuilding. So I find it fascinating from a physiological as well as aesthetic perspective. But this focus on aesthetics can be so intense that I think a lot of people are put off by the idea of building muscle because they are not interested in bodybuilding or in developing a physique. So then my question would be, what are the health benefits that building muscle comes with? Because one post you made that I really liked recently was one where you said, one of the biggest crises society faces is being under-muscled. And I would really love for you to speak on that.
Well, first off, I mean, this is a wonderful question. There's 2 things that I would like to preface this with. One, there is no issue if your goal is aesthetics. And I think that both you and I agree that there's no problem with that. I think that the real question is, why are we not valuing the other sides of the equation too. So when people say that they just want to look better, that's okay. That's a great reason to do it. But there's a lot more benefits to it than just that. Um, and so when we talk about skeletal muscle and some people being afraid of looking like a bodybuilder too, you have to understand that that's probably not going to happen. That's like being worried that if you get your driver's license, you're going to become like a NASCAR Formula One racer. Like it just doesn't happen. There's no way to immediately get too muscular. And so it's funny when people really first start to build muscle, when they had that fear, they realize, oh man, it's a lot harder to build muscle than I thought. And so you don't have to worry about becoming overly muscled. You can focus on these benefits that you're asking about and really see value in them without the concerns there. So what I think that people really don't always understand or value is that skeletal muscle is the largest metabolic tissue in the body, and it is completely one of the main things for maintaining homeostasis in overall health. I mean, it's the number one thing that you can do to reduce injury. And I think it's funny because people will always think, oh, well, I just need to go and stretch more or something like that. But whenever we look at the research regarding this, stretching does next to nothing for injury reduction risk. And this is something that drives people absolutely nuts whenever I say it. And I'm very happy to share the systemic reviews with people if they question this. But there have been 3 or 4 large scale reviews of all the literature out there. And not a single one finds stretching to be that significant in injury reduction. Every single one finds skeletal muscle mass as being the number one thing for reducing injury risk. So if you are bigger and stronger compared to frail and maybe never having trained before, you are much less likely to face injuries. And this is particularly important for aging populations. And it's something that we undervalue when we're younger and we don't really have those issues. But the more muscle that you can bank now, the longer and better quality of life you will have. I mean, it improves bone health, it improves mood and energy, brain and cardiovascular health, metabolic health, it improves overall quality of life, and it makes you live longer. And I think that even people that have these distinct requirements for aesthetics, and even if it's not building significant amounts of lean muscle, but just wanting a toned look or wanting that lean athletic look, it's extremely important to understand that having lean muscle is necessary for that. I mean, part of that thing that I mentioned with improving metabolic health is that the muscle itself secretes proteins called myokines. And these affect adipogenesis, which is the laying down of more fat tissue. It affects glucose production and insulin sensitivity. I mean, it makes you more insulin sensitive. It makes you less insulin resistant. The more muscle that you have, the more efficiently your body uses glucose. And so people will look at this as, oh, I just want to get, that lean athletic look without realizing that, hey, having a little bit more lean muscle means you can eat more carbs without more problems. I mean, the lean muscle itself is a major consumer of glucose in your body, especially during exercise. And it acts as a storage vessel for excess glucose. And so instead of your body storing excess glucose in fat tissue, it stores it in the muscle. Because if you've trained recently, it actually upregulates the amount of glucose storage that you have in skeletal muscle. It's up something like 125% increase. And so you can store more in the muscle, which allows your lean muscle to be a metabolic sink. It protects you from excess calories, from these major spikes in blood glucose that so many people are afraid of. Now, I'm not saying that we should all be monitoring blood glucose and freak out and do everything like that, but it becomes even less important the more lean muscle that you have because it allows you to be metabolically thrifty. And so there are these major benefits all over the place for having more skeletal muscle, and people just don't really see them because all they think of is, I just want to look good naked, which again is not a problem, but it becomes an issue long term if we don't realize that there are these other benefits that we can really, grasp hold of to keep our motivation high, to make us realize why we're doing these things, and to really value all the benefits that it brings.
Since you've mentioned glucose metabolism and insulin sensitivity, it's actually a good time to ask a question that I was going to keep for later because it's appropriate. So there is this fear mongering about carbohydrate and insulin and either or both potentially being a cause of excessive fat gain and therefore obesity. Now, could you explain what you think people need to understand about glucose metabolism and insulin, and whether there's any truth to these suggestions.
So what you're referring to is essentially termed the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis or theory. It's a hypothesis. It's actually been debunked, and there are tons of studies out there that look at this directly, and there's a bunch of good work by a guy named Hall out of the NIH in the United States. And some of the work that he did uses sequestration models. And this is the top level of nutrition research that you can possibly do. In some of the other research where people will say, oh, look, it's not about calories in, calories out, it's about the carbs and the insulin spikes. What they're doing is they're using a lot of research that just uses free form eating, which means they'll tell people, hey, go eat this amount and then send them home. And then they fill out a questionnaire and it says, okay, I ate this much. But the problem with that is we find that these free form questionnaires, people don't tend to be very accurate in their tracking. And so we get wonky results. In Hall's work and related work where they do these sequestration studies, if they take a person and they equate calories and protein and watch what happens to them over time, if they're in a calorie deficit, it doesn't matter the ratio of fats to carbs. It doesn't matter insulin spikes. It doesn't matter resting insulin rates. They lose similar amounts of weight. Body composition changes based off of equated protein and calories, essentially in a calorie deficit in particular. The conversation about insulin causing more fat gain. This has some relevance when you're in a calorie surplus. So if you have really high levels of insulin in a calorie surplus, yes, you can add more body fat and build less lean muscle. So if you have a metabolic disorder, then yes, this is one of the reasons why people with diabetes get into this spiral of they gained some body fat and then they became more insulin resistant. And then, over time, that insulin resistance leads to more body fat because high levels of insulin in the presence of a calorie surplus can cause more storage. But in the presence of a calorie deficit, the calorie deficit itself takes precedence over anything that has to do with insulin, cortisol, um, insulin resistance. None of these things matter because if you have less energy going into the system than what the system needs to function, it's got to pull energy from somewhere. It can't create it out of thin air. And so what it does is it will start to pull it from body fat stores. First, if you're exercising, it might pull it from muscle glycogen stores. And if it is severe enough, it might start to pull it from lean muscle. But this is a good question because people will get focused on, okay, well, then I just don't eat carbs and therefore I'll lose weight that way. But by not eating carbs, you're lowering your calories. And so if that puts you in a calorie deficit, that's why it's working. And a great example that I like to point out every time someone brings this up, because they'll be like, well, I've seen these guys like Fung and Asprey and um, D'Agostino, all these guys that push the carbohydrate insulin theory that's been debunked. You can easily debunk it these days because I like to point out the fact that Wegovy and Ozempic are these two medicines that people hear about all the time now. They everybody's bought in that they work, right? When you take these medications, you actually end up having higher circulating insulin levels, yet we lose weight. And so if this theory of the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis worked, Wegovy and Ozempic wouldn't work. But they work because the way that they work is they lower your appetite. And so you eat less. And so calories go down. So despite the fact that insulin goes up, calorie intake goes down. And these work. And this was a fun conversation that I actually had this conversation probably 4 or 5 years ago. I started saying that when we had these drugs and we were seeing all this stuff. But this was before it became public knowledge, before people really realized that it works so well. And so I would bring this up and people would be like, well, that doesn't mean anything to me. Now, these days, it's great because I can point it out and they're like, oh, those do work. Like, yeah, they do. And there's enough public, knowledge about it these days that the people are just bought in. So these guys that are really trying to push this carbohydrate insulin theory to you will do one of a few things. They'll show you data in diabetics, and we're assuming that you don't have a metabolic disorder. They'll show you data in a calorie surplus. And if you're trying to lose body fat, you're not in a calorie surplus. So the actions of insulin don't matter anyways, or cortisol. They don't matter as far as fat loss goes or weight loss goes. Or they'll use studies that use this thing called doubly labeled water. And when you use doubly labeled water in low carbohydrate conditions, it can cause some errors in the conclusions, and it can make it appear that that weight loss is better in low carb conditions, even though when actually control these things, like I said, in sequestration studies, you don't see a superiority to any ratios of fat and carbs. Now, it's true carbs are essentially the only non-essential macronutrient. That doesn't mean that they don't have benefits. But when I talk about changing these ratios of carbs, you have to get a certain amount of fat in your diet for health purposes. You don't have to get a certain amount of carbs. And so it becomes this almost in vogue thing to lower your carbs because if you tell people just don't eat carbs, it's almost an immediate way to put them in a calorie deficit. And then they'll say, "Oh, well, I feel a lot better." Well, you feel better because you're losing body fat. And this is one of the biggest things in an obese society that makes a huge difference for overall health markers. That doesn't mean that you're going to be optimally healthy. And if we can get people to actually understand that it's not the loss of carbs that's causing this, it's the adjustment to calories, then we can start to have nutrition that's one, more sustainable, but two, probably more effective long term. Because certain amounts of carbs can be very beneficial for building lean muscle. And as we just went over, lean muscle has all these other benefits. So you'll get your friend Deborah from down the street, and she'll do keto. And within the first 6 or 7 weeks, she'll be down in a significant amount of weight. Now, the reason that weight loss is faster initially with keto is because it also drops muscle glycogen and water, because when you have no carbs in your system, you lose all of that. And so this gives them the mental buy-in that keto works really well when they realize they're not losing fat faster, they're losing weight faster, and then it's going to plateau. And so check back with all these people that say keto is the greatest thing in the world in the first 4 to 6 weeks or so. Check back in 8 months. And all of a sudden it'll be, oh yeah, I couldn't do that long term. One, it was an unsustainable thing. But two, all of a sudden my results stalled. And the results stalled because your muscle glycogen stores and the water stores had finally stabilized, and then it was back down to just calories itself. And so people look at um, this equation with, okay, well, what trick can I do to make my body lose body fat? And unfortunately, it always goes back to calories.
Much as some people would like to find other culprits, indeed. So thank you for answering that. Going back to muscle being the largest metabolic tissue in the body, my next question would be that when you're looking at somebody with obesity, they typically carry more muscle mass than somebody who doesn't have the excess body fat. However, my understanding is that there's a difference between the muscle that you grow with resistance training and healthy eating habits and the muscle that you grow as a result of obesity by forcing the body to sustain the excess weight. So could you explain if that's correct and what the difference is?
Well, there's a they like to phrase it, there's metabolically healthy muscle, and then that's high in quality that contributes to metabolic health, and then there is muscle that's not quite as healthy. And this is based on degree of myosteatosis, which is a fancy way to say the amount of fat buildup within the muscle itself. And so higher levels of this are associated with increased insulin resistance, increased risk of metabolic disorders. It negatively impacts muscle function, strength, and mobility, and is associated with higher mortality levels. And this is something that's really distinct from um, things like sarcopenia. Remember how I said earlier, having more muscle makes you it gives you a much better quality of life later in life. So just because you have muscle in these situations where you're obese doesn't mean it contributes to long-term health in the same way that the metabolically healthy muscle does. And that's what you're getting at here. And so, this is a distinct disease compared to something like sarcopenia, which is the lack of lean muscle or loss of lean muscle over time. And so, this muscle that has the higher fat buildup within the muscle tissue is, in practicality, not as healthy as regular lean muscle. And so, this is another one of those instances where getting into that calorie deficit and losing excess body fat can become very, very beneficial, because having this excess fat, even within muscular tissue, is problematic because it causes essentially low grade to moderate grade inflammation throughout the entire body. This is that chronic inflammation that we're always scared about. And this is why obesity causes these major problems with, insulin regulation or metabolic disorders and all these other problems that we have. Um, because the fat tissue itself, fat cells, they release something called adipokines. And adipokines are proteins that are released from the fat cells themselves that cause inflammation to build and build and build and build. And if we let this excess amount of body fat sit around for long periods of time, we essentially just become an inflammation factory. And I'm not one of those people that's like, you need to go out and you need to do all these special tricks to lower chronic inflammation. I mean, the trick to lowering chronic inflammation is weight train, get nutrition under control. Like, again, we always go back to these same things, but there's a reason that we do go back to these same things, because it is a cascade of changes within the body that is going to make a huge difference in overall health. And so yes, there is a metabolically healthy type of muscle versus a metabolically less healthy type of muscle, and it's due to this fat buildup within the muscle. And just like we were talking about before, the real way to treat these things and to reverse this insulin resistance, to give your muscle function back, to reverse immobility and all these problems with life, is to lose the excess body fat.
I would love to pause on inflammation because that's such a buzzword these days.
It
And
is.
I'd
I was
love,
I was I was sitting there going, should I even say inflammation? Because this opens up an entire other door of
yeah,
things that you can run down.
I see the can of worms and I'm basically kind of dive bombing into it because I want to ask you, can you define what inflammation actually is?
I mean, inflammation is a negative health state where your body is um, creating reactive oxygenation species and a bunch of other things that essentially put your body into overdrive to try to correct. And this is similar to where we get off track with metabolic health. Our body sees that we're having, issues controlling blood glucose, so it upregulates insulin, and so we have these compensatory mechanisms in the body to address these problems, right? And at first, they're great. Actually, insulin resistance is a good thing. Insulin resistance initially is a way to prevent further fat gain. However, insulin resistance long term is very problematic. And so think of it from the fact that insulin is a storage hormone. If we know that insulin is a storage hormone and we know that in a calorie surplus, it can cause us to store more body fat, right? It can also cause more storage into muscle tissue if you're insulin sensitive in muscle tissue. If you're insulin sensitive in the fat cell, it causes more storage in the fat. It can cause more storage in the muscle tissue too. Insulin resistance initially is a good thing. And this goes back to the compensatory mechanisms. Because if we are storing body fat too quickly, our body says, oh, hold up. We want to stop this because excess body fat causes all these downstream effects that are really problematic. So if I make myself more insulin resistant, then it's going to block some of that uptake into the fat cells. The problem happens long term, and this is similar to how inflammation works. With initially, it's a great thing, and under certain circumstances, it's a really good thing. But long term, it becomes problematic because then we start to get backups of other things going on in the body. In insulin sense, we start to get constantly elevated blood glucose, which causes a whole bunch of issues and causes that machinery to break down. In inflammation sense, it causes the reactive oxygenated species and some of the other things to back up, and then our body's constantly trying to fight that. So inflammation initially in acute senses can be a very good thing. It's actually one of the driving forces behind adaptation to your weight training. Inflammation from exercise is a good thing. Cortisol release from exercise is a good thing. But chronic issues with inflammation, cortisol, insulin, that throws the system out of whack. And that's where we'll see these guys that fearmonger these types of things. They'll show you data and they'll say, hey, look, under this circumstance, it's really, really bad. Or they won't even say that. They'll just say, hey, look, this is really, really bad, and they'll show you a circumstance where it's been thrown out of whack and your body is struggling to control it, rather than showing, hey, look, these are nuanced hormones or signalers in the body, and under some circumstances it's good, under some circumstances it's bad, and controlling the bad circumstances and promoting the good ones are what we should really be focusing on, rather than vilifying these flat out. So it was a circuitous way to answer that question, but I wanted to put things in perspective because there are all these systems in the body that work in a similar manner with this nuance that if we just understand that our body has these compensatory mechanisms and that they're probably serving a good purpose, at least initially, then that can make us less afraid of them as a general rule and really help us to understand what they're actually doing.
Oh, I don't think it was circuitous at all. It was pretty straightforward to me. And thank you for answering that question. Now, going back to the lean muscle versus adipose tissue, so body composition. I was trying to think of the word and it was on the tip of my tongue. Finally, it came back. I want to come back to body composition and talk about a term that's very common in the fitness community, and that's being skinny fat. So could you define what does it mean to be skinny fat? And then I would like to ask your opinion on how one should go about changing their physique if they perceive that they fall into this category.
Skinny fat is essentially a it's a colloquial term for having poor body composition but not being obese. It's a combination of really low levels of lean muscle and having some excess body fat. So instead of actually looking obese, you just kind of look doughy. And so people have to understand to get that athletic or toned look that they're going for. This is where we were talking about before. You have to build lean muscle, and you have to have significant amounts of lean muscle to actually see that. I mean, the more lean muscle that you have, the higher of a body fat level you can be at and still look toned. Without lean muscle, that's where you just kind of look doughy and soft. And so when people come to me and they say, okay, well, I think that I'm skinny fat, what should I do to correct this? I feel for them because this is the situation where you need the most patience. You need more patience when you're skinny fat than when you're obese. And I mean that from a practical sense because if I get somebody that comes to work with me and they're obese, you can see benefits and changes to the better very quickly. I mean, you can put a person on a calorie deficit and good nutrition, and you can start to see, the scale drop every 2, 3, 4 weeks. Body composition starts to look better within a few months. You can get really motivated by the fact that you're looking better in the mirror. You can see really big changes in the way that your pants fit, the way that your shirts fit really quickly. If you're really skinny and you're trying to build muscle, you can start to see gains in weight relatively quickly. When you're skinny fat, the answer for skinny fat is that most likely you're going to be hovering around maintenance calories. You're not going to be in a distinct cut or a distinct build. And so changes are going to be slower. You're probably in most cases going to be slightly under maintenance calories to lose a little bit of body fat to make yourself feel a little bit better about body composition at first. I mean, if you don't have significant amounts of body fat and you're just a little doughy, sticking around maintenance for maybe a year or two might be a smart thing for many people. And yes, I do mean a year or two. And that's what really blows people's minds is that this is not a process that's going to clean up in 4, 5, 6 months. It just won't because building lean muscle takes time. And it takes time when you have a perfect plan in place, let alone, the plans that people have in real life because you're never going to be 100% on plan. You're never going to, always have the best motivation possible. And so we essentially take the scenic route to get where we want to be. And so it can take years. And you're certainly going to see progress along the way as you are focusing on building lean muscle during that period, but it's going to be a lot slower than what you want. And so in these situations where people say, okay, well, I'm skinny fat, I want to correct this. I tell them we can do it as fast as is humanly possible, but the reality is building lean muscle takes time. And the best thing that you can do in the meantime is rather than focusing on changes in the mirror, which are going to probably be the slowest sign of progress over this period, start to focus on your performance. Are you lifting more in the gym over time? Are you getting stronger, faster? Are you feeling better? Are you starting to recover better? Are you able to handle more volume? And if you start to focus on performance outcomes as your metric of success, you're going to have a much better time long term because it's going to give you something to focus on that can actually see changes within weeks to month time frame as opposed to many months at a time. And so skinny fat, I feel for this population because it is the hardest to change from a mental and emotional perspective. You can get there. It's just going to take a lot longer than what you hope. But if you focus on these performance changes, you're going to be doing yourself a real benefit because that's what's going to be necessary to actually get over this hurdle.
So you've mentioned that most people will likely stick um, to a small deficit, so a little bit below maintenance. Maybe some people may go a little bit above that, but on
Yeah.
average, people hover around maintenance. Could you characterize what criteria you would look at to decide whether to put a client who comes to you in a small deficit straight up around maintenance, so no intention of really seeing a deficit or a surplus, and or a slight surplus if they believe they are skinny fat?
This is going to be mainly dependent on emotion and the way that they feel mentally. And I say that because for motivation's sake, it might make sense to lose a little bit more body fat, to compromise a little bit of that lean muscle progress and lose a little bit more body fat because maybe that'll be mentally and emotionally motivating for them. And so I have a conversation with people and I say, okay, well, what's most important to you? Because the skinny fat people will typically say, I want to get more toned, or I want to build muscle and lose fat, or a combination of that. And if you're an experienced coach, you kind of learn how to interpret what people are saying to see where they want to go ultimately with their physique. And so if they're closer to obesity, that makes it a little bit easier because you say, okay, well, let's just go into a slight deficit. If they're kind of that mid range, I mean, for men, if you're like 20% to mid 20s or something like that, that's where you kind of get into this range of, okay, well, what do they really want to do? What are they telling me without telling me when we're having these conversations? That's when you start to make those calls of, okay, well, what would be best for them mentally and emotionally? Where can we take them, as far as optimizing the lean muscle that they gain, because that's the number one goal for the coach. The goal for the coach is to get them to build lean muscle. When they say, I want to look toned, in their mind, it's lose body fat, but that's not really what they're saying. They just don't know what they're saying. And so what they're really saying is, I need more muscle. How do we get them there in a way that they will accept emotionally and be able to get them what they want, because ultimately as the coach that their end goal, that what they have in mind is what you're working towards. They just don't know the right way to get there, and they think, I need to lose fat first, or that's going to be my sign of success. Whereas if you put them into a cut, or you put them into too deep of a deficit, they'll certainly lose the body fat, but then they'll just end up looking gaunt. They won't have that shape to their body, they won't have the health, they won't have the performance benefits. And so doing that, you'll get the person thin, and then they'll be like, I don't really look that great. And then you'll be like, okay, well, now that we've gotten there and we realize that we don't really look that great, we need to add weight back on to build muscle back up. So we essentially just spun your wheels during that time. All of that time that you spent losing that body fat was essentially wasted, because the longer that you spend in that deficit, or the deeper that deficit is, the happier the client might be because they're seeing body fat loss, but the longer their whole process is going to take, because they're not actually adding muscle. And unless you're brand new to training or on steroids, you're not adding significant amounts of muscle while in a calorie deficit. And you might have seen that. I did a post on that literally just like last week, where I showed a very well run study that showed how much muscle you gain in a calorie deficit. And unless that calorie deficit is very modest, you're probably not gaining any muscle. And in fact, you're probably losing some. And so that's why for these people that are skinny fat, hovering around maintenance probably makes more sense, or being at maintenance for a year or two, if you are mentally and emotionally comfortable with that, probably makes more sense than anything else. Because mentally and emotionally, you may be very upset if you start to gain more body fat, because you're like, oh, this is really not working. Even though it may be optimizing the amount of lean muscle that you gain, that's not going to feel good. So if you can get the person to say, hey, look, this is what we're dealing with. We're bound by biology. We can't beat biology, not unless you've got steroids that you want to throw into the mix. And I always say that because I have to point that out, because people will be like, well, my buddy who had been lifting for 5 years all of a sudden gained 20 pounds of muscle and lost 6% body fat in 6 months. And you're like, got some bad news for you. It's not going to happen for you. And so you have to bring up these situations so people understand what's actually going on. And if mentally and emotionally we know that we probably wouldn't be good with adding more body fat, and if we're closer to obesity, we don't want to from a health perspective. If you're 20%, you can probably add some more and be completely fine from a health perspective for a man, certainly for a woman. But for a man, you can certainly add some more body fat there and be fine. But emotionally, if we're not okay with that, we say, okay, well, then our alternatives are hold around maintenance, which would be more optimal for building lean muscle, since that's your number one deficiency. It's not that you have too much body fat when you're skinny fat, it's that you have too little muscle. Or alternatively, we go into the slight calorie deficit. We don't do too much because then we're just going to be spinning our wheels. We go into maybe a 100 or 200 calorie per day deficit, and then we ride that wave for as long as we can. And then once you start to feel a little bit more comfortable with your body composition because you lost a little bit of fat and probably gained a little bit of muscle, then we switch gears and we have that conversation. Okay, can we start to add calories in now? Are you going to be comfortable with how you're doing, with the fact that you're progressing? And then let's say we start to actually add more muscle now than the rate that we were doing before. And so by switching into that slight calorie deficit, we can get more of a mental and emotional buy-in from the client or the person that's doing it, so they trust the process. And then when they feel better, that's when we have that conversation of, okay, it might now be time to start adding calories back in, because still your problem is you don't have enough lean muscle, but you might now be more comfortable with how things are going. You might feel more confident in the way that things are moving. You might feel more confident in the program itself. And so now you might feel more comfortable with switching gears and actually doing what we probably should have done from the start, but maybe you weren't ready for. So skinny fat is it's a minefield to navigate. And it's a minefield to navigate both for the coach and for the person that's going through it. As long as the person understands what your options are and the pros and cons of those options, they can make the right choice for themselves. Because like you said before, there are plans that are perfect on paper, but they're not necessarily perfect in the season of a person's life. And just because as a coach, I know that the perfect plan on paper is to be at maintenance for 2 years, doesn't mean that that's going to be accepted by the client or that's what they want. And so you might have that client have a longer road to get to their ultimate goal, but as long as they understand their options, they understand that it's the longer road to their goal, it might be the right move for them. Because again, as you coach longer and longer, you find that it's more a psychological job than it is a scientific job, and so you're dealing with a person's emotions. And that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong for anybody listening to this. If you have that feeling of, well, I just can't emotionally handle seeing myself gain more body fat right now. Okay, great. We can still work towards your goal. It may not be the fastest way towards your goal, but it might be the best way towards your goal for you. And so that's where we make that decision of, okay, well, what's better? Going into a slight deficit, staying around maintenance, maybe going into a slight surplus. In some cases with skinny fat, that's more rare. It's possible. It's more rare. But you're going to be hovering around maintenance in some manner with adjustments made mainly for emotional purposes.
I'm so glad you brought up the emotional and psychological aspect of being skinny fat, but also of approaching a fitness journey in general, because I agree with you completely. Sometimes, and that's also why I take issue with looking at an optimal approach in a vacuum, because nobody lives in a vacuum. We all have emotions, we all have
Mhm.
things that are going on in our life outside of fitness. So, as you say, sometimes we don't take the most optimal road. We take the road that will get you there. And
Right.
sometimes that needs to be the one that takes a little bit longer, but the one that you're actually going to stick to. Because I don't care that the optimal program gets you there in 6 days if you're going to fall off after one.
Right. And I like, this is why I like terming it as the scenic route, because it really is the scenic route. Maybe it's not the fastest route, but maybe it's the most enjoyable. And so it's a very apt analogy, because just like, if you go on a drive and you want to go through a really like pretty wooded area instead of just a stretch of highway, maybe it's a better trip for you. And you've got to make that call for yourself. And I think that people are adults, and as long as they're given the right information, they can. Now, it can be discouraging to hear, okay, it's going to take longer to do it that way. Don't get discouraged. Realize that it's going to be moving you towards your goals, and you just need to make that right choice that you're going to be okay with.
Absolutely. And on that note, we are going to end the podcast on one question that came up as you were talking, because you've mentioned body fat percentages in passing. And it's not something I've really touched on a lot on the podcast before, but they are used in a very widespread manner across the fitness community. And I think this can create some confusion for people who aren't coaches and who may not know what you or I may know. So I would like for you to explain to people how body fat percentage can or cannot be estimated versus actually calculated accurately, what it is that a coach might be referring to, like how are they extrapolating this body fat percentage, and whether a layperson needs to worry about their specific body fat percentage or not.
This is a conversation that could take up an entire podcast itself. It's a really good question. Um, for the average person, don't even worry about it. It doesn't matter. Like if you feel like you need to lose body fat because you're unhappy with where you are, assuming that there's not body dysmorphia in play. That's my, you know, my one saying for this. Assuming that that's not in play, just get to where you want to be and what is sustainable for you. If you want to be leaner, certainly work to get leaner. If you want to build more muscle, certainly work to build more muscle. You don't need to know your body fat percentage. There is no coach that is going to make any changes to your program based off of a body fat percentage, because we're typically not taking them in any manner to make any adjustments. We make adjustments off of your emotional status, what you're telling us, rates of loss or gain on the scale, changes in circumference measurements, and changes in progress photos. These things in combination are far more accurate than anything that you can do as far as getting any distinct readings for body fat percentage. And part of the reason that is the methods that we have for estimating body fat percentage typically are not any better than BMI, than just using BMI. I mean, in-body bioelectrical impedance, that's what in-body uses, has an average error of about 8%. And so that's massive, and this is kind of hard to conceptualize in an audio form. It's easier if I were to write this down for you. But let's say that you have, let's say in real world, you're 20% body fat. This is just what you are. And you get an in-body reading and it says you're at 19% body fat. So it's 1% off. It's within that 8% range of error. The problem with it is it's not a standardized error. So let's say that you go back a week later and it says you're 22%. Well, that's still within the 8% range because it's 8% in both directions. You think that you've just gained 3%. Because did I say 22 or 21? It doesn't matter. You think that you've gained 2 or 3%. In reality, you could still be 20%. The first one could have been wrong. The second one could have been wrong. So what do we do with that information? Nothing. We don't worry about it because it doesn't mean anything. So until you get outside of those ranges of error, you don't know anything. And when you come in at 20% and it says 19%, you don't know if you have any change until you get down to about 12%. And so if it tells you that you're at 12%, in reality, you could be 19%. So you could think that you lost a whole bunch, but maybe you only lost 1%, but you're still within that 8% margin of error. And like I said, it's different every time. And this is different every time because things like bioelectrical impedance have these big errors. And they've got big errors because what it does is it passes an electric current through yourself. And so the electric current can miss large parts of your body. If you're standing on an electrical plate, it could just go from 1 foot to your groin to down and out. And so it could give you a wrong percent. If you're holding things and it goes through, it could go through an outer layer of body fat, not reach inner layers, and then go all the way out on the other side. You can have issues with the fact that it is an equation that is based off of a guesstimate. So when they make these equations for how the machines determine your body fat percentage, in-body or whoever's doing the bioelectrical impedance thing will look at an equation that is based off of something like a bod pod or hydrostatic weighing. And they'll say, okay, well, based on this equation, let's set up an equation for the bioelectrical impedance. But that original equation was also a guesstimate. So now you've made a guesstimate on a guesstimate, which is why each one of these things tends to have larger and larger errors. And even in the best one that is the most available for people, DEXA, you have a 3 to 4% error. And so changes in body fat percentage, until they go outside of that range, can be questionable at best. And so when you're taking these measurements, if you're going to take one, take DEXA, but don't take it any sooner than every 4 to 6 months. And so if you're not taking it any sooner than every 4 to 6 months, how are you making changes to your program? Because you're not even noticing whether or not you should make a change for like 6 months. And so that's why in practicality, you can't use any of these things to get any good information. They just don't matter. And so what we do is we'll use a combination of, like I said, progress photos, circumference measurements, and scale weight, and then based off of how you're telling us that you are feeling emotionally. And that's how we make some of the changes to the programs. And even doing things like visual assessment, comparing coaches will over time start to realize what certain body fat percentages look like based off of pictures. If you're in a well lit picture, you can take a look at them, and your margin of error based off of that visual assessment is probably better than in body, just off of a visual assessment. It's more accurate. And so people are paying for these things. They're paying for these scales at home that tell them this information. They're paying for in bodies, and they could have had more accurate measurements by just looking at themselves in a picture. And so it's really frustrating when online influencers are selling these scales and selling these different measurement techniques, when in reality, I mean, a caliper is probably more accurate, assuming you don't have loose skin from significant weight loss. Visual assessment is probably the most accurate and practical. And if you don't know how to do this, this is where you ask a coach to help give you an idea. And like I said, I mean, your personal preference on where you would like to go for health and for physique is probably more important than any of this. If you're saying, hey, look, I've got what I feel is excess body fat and I need to lose weight, well, there's your answer right there. Well, we just need to get into a calorie deficit then, and then we'll monitor that rate of loss to make those adjustments. As long as you're in a proper rate of gain or rate of loss, that's where you'll make those adjustments to your calorie amounts, to your activity amounts, and that's how your coach will do it, because frankly, that's all that matters. If you are losing faster, if you're trying to lose body fat and you're losing faster than proper rates of loss over time, you're probably losing significant amounts of lean muscle. And so that's where your coach will dial it back. It's not dialed back based off of any measurements from body fat percentage. We're saying, how quickly is this person losing weight? And are they outside of that first 4 to 6 week period where we're having water flux and muscle glycogen flux? Because you'll certainly see losses quicker in that first period. Outside of that, once we've stabilized our rate of loss or gain, are we within a range that makes sense for proper rate of loss or gain? That's where we'll make those adjustments to your nutrition. That's where we'll make those adjustments to your activity levels to get you into those proper rates. If you're in those proper rates, that is the best chance possible for losing the most body fat, for retaining the most lean muscle, or for gaining the most lean muscle in those periods. So people will always bring up these, oh, well, I got this scan and it says this. Okay, great. Like, as a coach, it's really funny because they'll send it to you and you'll immediately like look at it and say, I'm not using this at all. This gives me no information that would be practical. And just as a fun example, for bioelectrical impedance, and the reason that I keep bringing this up is because it's the most common one. It's the one, in body and stand on plates and hold those devices and those things. As a fun trick that you can do, if somebody is really selling you on this and is like, I swear this works, this is great. And what they'll do is they'll show you percentages and they'll say, okay, this has a 1% margin of error. They're not lying, because what they're doing is they're doing these things are great on a population level, because like I said, they've got like an 8% margin of error, right? In both directions. So they'll have somebody who had an 8% extra on their reading. And then they'll also have somebody that'll have like a 7% less on their reading. And that goes down to 1% error, because if you average those two together, it sounds really good. And that's how they give you those, they say, the really small margins of error. They're not small for an individual. They're small if you take 100,000 people into account. And so one of the ways that you can test this and see how funny this is, because of all these different things that affect it, including hydration status, you can get an in-body and then for 10 minutes, leave the room, go drink a liter of water, and come back in. And it will tell you that you just gained significant amounts of lean body mass and lost a significant amount of body fat, literally within those 10 minutes, just because you changed your hydration status. And so people have this idea that, okay, these are going to be great because they've got this 1% margin of error, when in reality, that's a population error. That's not an individual error. And they think that, okay, well, maybe if Allan's saying that this has this really big error, it'll be okay because I realize that there's error and I'm just going to use it as a relative measure. Meaning, if I'm 20%, it says I'm 19 the first reading. Well, if I go back in the second time and it says I'm 18%, then I've lost a percent. Doesn't work like that either because of that variance in both directions and because that variance is not standardized. So this is it's a fun long conversation that we can continue on for long periods of time, but I think that the idea there is fairly obvious. After talking about it for a bit, these are used essentially to make money, and I don't think that every coach that's pushing these, or every gym, because gyms push them a lot, I don't think that they know what it's really doing. And I think that they've been told by people, this has that 1% margin of error or whatever it is. And that sounds great. And they'll show you studies that show this. And it's true. It has a population error that's very low. It's just not like that with an individual. And until you're told that straight up, you're like, oh, that's what they're showing me. And it's like, yes. And I think that a lot of these gyms that have bought into this, they realize that one, a lot of people get these. And so they can charge like, 40, 50, $60, $100 a pop for these things. And people will get them every month or two because they think that this is a way to see if they're moving in the right direction. And so in their mind, they're selling something that has a 1% margin of error, and they're selling a lot of it. So this seems like a win-win to them because they think that they're doing the right thing, when in reality, BMI probably would have worked better. And BMI certainly has its faults, but it's just as accurate, if not a little bit more accurate than in body. And people just don't realize that. And they hate being told this because it's like, oh shit, I spent that much money on something that is that inaccurate. Yeah, you did. And so unless you're willing to get something like an MRI on the regular, which is both really bad for you and very expensive, it doesn't matter. And on top of that, you're not going to be using it for programming anyways. Because again, the number one thing that you would use and the most accurate thing that you'd use and the healthiest thing that you would use is rate of loss or gain. And so when you got a coach that's like, yeah, this is just, it's great that you sent this to me, but I'm going to hit delete immediately and not even look at it, because that's what we do, because there's no information in that. And people feel really proud of themselves because when you get these things done, you feel like you're taking control of your health. You feel like you're investing in yourself because you're using this technology to really to get involved. And the same thing happens with these sleep trackers and with these calorie burn trackers that you wear on your wrist or the ring. Bad news, those don't work either. But it gives you the same feeling. It's, I'm taking control. I'm doing these things that really motivate me because I feel like I'm taking those steps towards where I want to be. When in reality, you're probably just losing a bit of money, and it's not your fault that you've been tricked, because there's certainly nuance to it. But it's good to learn that where you're making these mistakes, and then probably correct that from the future, and progress a little bit better and save money.
And to circle back to what you started with when you were saying that you want to direct people's attention towards what really matters, I view body fat percentage as yet another number, like the number on the scale that gets people obsessed when, as you've spent some time discussing, it's really not that important. Body fat percentage even less so than the number on the scale. But
Right.
yet people would get so obsessed with it that they will they will forget to take a step back and look at the bigger picture and the importance of what you actually have under your control, which is not your body fat percentage or any other number really, but what you do on a day-to-day basis.
Well, the biggest problem with it is it's at some point it's going to bite you in the ass. In body and BIA is going to bite you in the ass at some point. And people will be like, well, I used it and then I saw that my number went down the second time that I used it and it really motivated me. Okay, cool. But that's because it's moving in the direction that you want it to move. What happens if that error shifts in the direction you don't want it to move? So you think that you gained 1 or 2% body fat, when in reality you could have lost 4 or 5% body fat. Now you're having an existential crisis because you think that you gained body fat from a super error prone system when you actually lost body fat. And so I really try to steer people away from these things, because it can be super motivating when it's working in the direction that you want, even if it's not accurate. I mean, it could tell you that you lost body fat when you didn't. So that can be super motivating, but what happens when it's not? And, is that going to throw you off? When in reality, what we could have been doing is we could have been focusing on, how you look in the mirror, how you feel, how your pants are fitting, how you're performing, all of these other things that you can actually track and feel good about and use as a whole to give you indications of whether or not you're moving in the right direction. So if we can move away from these things that are essentially ticking time bombs, you can probably do yourself a lot of good in the long run.
Absolutely. And honestly, Alan, I could talk to you for an age because we agree on basically everything and you're so articulate. But I also know that you've got to go. So I want to draw this episode to a close, but I will definitely have you back on to discuss other aspects of this fitness experience. But before we go, I want to give you the opportunity to tell people where they can connect with you and learn more from you.
You can check out my website, mauiathletics.com, or you can look me up on Instagram, Dr. Allan Bacon. It's DRALLAN Bacon. And yeah, I mean, if you've got any questions about anything we talked about today, if you'd like to see some of the research that we talked about, certainly send me a message. I'm happy to help.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the conversation, Alan. Thank you, dear listeners, for tuning in as always, and I will talk to you next time.
Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.